A single dad CEO went on a blind date for a friend, but fell in love with a destitute girl at first sight. Chicago's skyline bled gold as the sun dipped behind glass towers. But inside Daniel Harper's penthouse, chaos reigned. A CEO in command of empires could not command a toddler's fort of pillows, where Sophie ruled with her stuffed rabbit. He smiled, tired but alive, until his phone rang with urgency. A friend demanding he cover a blind date tonight. He hated the idea, yet Sophie's small voice whispered, "Please, Daddy, adventure." Minutes later, city streets swallowed them both. Horns blared, neon smeared across wet asphalt, and winter air stung like needles. Then it happened. Daniel caught sight of a young woman in a torn coat, cheeks flushed, arguing fiercely with a taxi driver over a $10 fare. Her voice cracked with pride, not weakness. Daniel stepped forward and paid the driver without hesitation. But she did not thank him. She stared with stone gray eyes, pulled out a crumpled bill, and pressed it against his hand. "I don't owe anyone," she said steady, almost defiant. For a moment time bent. An empire CEO and a girl who owned nothing but her pride stood locked in silence. Sophie watching from the car window like a witness to fate. Daniel thought he would never see her again. He was wrong. The glow of a polished restaurant sign lit her face as she walked inside ahead of him. The hostess looked down at the reservation list, and their names lined up side by side. The night Daniel tried to avoid had already begun rewriting his entire life. What happened when their eyes met across that table was something no one, least of all Daniel, was ready for. Daniel Harper adjusted the cuffs of his delirious shirt, while his daughter Sophie laughed from the living room floor. Her pillow fort had swallowed half the penthouse, toys scattered across polished wood like tiny landmines. Daniel's schedule was stacked with meetings, reports and calls, yet none of that seemed to matter when Sophie clutched her stuffed rabbit and asked him to help build another tower of cushions. For a moment he forgot the endless responsibilities that came with being both CEO and single father, simply letting himself be pulled into her laughter. The phone rang again. Nathan's name flashed across the screen. Daniel debated ignoring it, but Sophie reached for the glowing device and handed it to him like a command. "Uncle Nate," she exclaimed. Daniel sighed and answered. Nathan's voice rushed through the line, anxious. "Listen, I need a huge favor. I promised a friend I'd meet someone for a blind date tonight, but I can't make it. You owe me, remember? Please, just this once." Daniel pinched the bridge of his nose. Dating was the last thing on his mind, but Nathan kept pleading. "It's nothing serious, just dinner." "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate." Daniel looked around the room. Sophie had already climbed into his lap, pressing her rabbit against his chest. "Daddy, go?" she asked. The word was small but carried surprising weight. He had resisted the idea of stepping back into the dating world for years, afraid of betraying the memory of his late wife, afraid of letting anyone close enough to her again. Yet Sophie's eyes sparkled with mischief, and he could not deny her excitement. "All right," he muttered into the phone. "But I'm bringing Sophie." Nathan laughed in relief. "Perfect, you'll thank me later." Evening descended quickly over Chicago. Streetlights flickered to life, glowing halos against the gathering dusk. Daniel carried Sophie to the waiting town car, bundled in a red coat with rabbit ears on the hood. She giggled as the driver helped him inside. Daniel loosened his tie, staring at the skyline as they rolled toward the magnificent mile. Towers of steel and glass reflected streaks of neon, while the rhythm of traffic pulsed below. His phone buzzed again with messages from executives, but he ignored them, choosing instead to watch Sophie press her hands against the window, marveling at the city's glow. The car slowed near Michigan Avenue. Horns blared, pedestrians hurried against the chill, and storefronts glittered with holiday lights, though the season had already passed. Sophie pressed her nose against the window, pointing at decorations. Daniel chuckled. Then, the movement outside caught his attention. A woman in a worn coat argued heatedly with a taxi driver. Her voice rose above the din, sharp with frustration. Daniel tapped the glass, signaling the driver to stop. Curiosity tugged at him, though he told himself he was on being practical. The woman was young, maybe mid-20s. Her cheeks flushed from the cold and the weight of argument. "It was 10, not 20, she insisted, holding a crumpled bill. The driver shook his head, waving dismissively. Daniel pulled the bill from his wallet and pressed it into the driver's hand, ending the quarrel before it escalated. The man muttered thanks and drove off, tires splashing through slush. The woman stiffened. She turned on Daniel with storm gray eyes that held no gratitude, only defiance. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, voice taut. She pressed the bill against his hand, refusing to let the debt stand. He felt the rough edges of the paper, a tangible mark of her pride. For a moment neither moved. Then she stepped back, clutching her coat tighter, and walked away without another word. Daniel returned to the car, unsettled. Her face lingered in his thoughts as they drove closer to the restaurant. He had seen desperation countless times in business. Investors, competitors, even employees begging for chances. But this was different. This was resilience, carved deep into someone's soul. Sophie broke his reverie with a giggle, holding her rabbit high like a victory. She was strong, Sophie declared. Daniel blinked at his daughter, wondering how much she had understood. Perhaps children saw more than adults gave them credit for. Lucien stood gleaming at the corner of the boulevard, its glass doors opening to polished brass and soft jazz spilling into the night. Daniel carried Sophie inside, the air warm with the scent of roasted herbs and candle wax. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, their trays balancing crystal glasses. The host smiled politely, asking for a reservation. Harper, Daniel replied. He adjusted Sophie's coat as she toiled beside him. Behind them footsteps echoed. Daniel. The same woman from the street stood there, coat folded over her arm now, pride still in her stance. His pulse skipped. Fate, coincidence or some cruel joke, he could not tell. The host's eyes darted between them, scanning the list. Mr. Harper and guest, Miss Brooke. Daniel felt the ground shift. Sophie's small hand found his, grounding him. The woman, Lila Brooks, gave a quick nod, her jaw set as though daring anyone to question her presence. Daniel guided Sophie toward the table, his guarded heart tightening. He had agreed to a blind date as a favor, nothing more, but the universe had rewritten the rules without his permission. Sophie climbed into her seat, rabbit still clutched tight. Daniel adjusted his cuff again, forcing composure. Across the table, Lila unfolded her napkin with deliberate precision, her eyes refusing to reveal what she thought of this collision. The city outside pressed against the glass, horns echoing faintly, while inside a silence heavier than any boardroom negotiation hung between them. Daniel exhaled slowly, reminding himself this was temporary, just one evening. Yet the image of storm-gray eyes would not fade, nor would the echo of pride in her voice. He sensed this night would not end as easily as Nathan had promised. Ever met someone who changed your day in seconds? The host guided them to a corner table where warm light spilled from brass lamps, bouncing off crystal glasses. Daniel steadied Sophie's chair, her tiny legs swinging above the floor as she clutched her rabbit with both hands. The moment still felt unreal. Of all possible strangers in Chicago, the woman from the street had turned out to be his blind date. Lila removed her coat, revealing a navy dress that was simple yet elegant, the kind that didn't shout but whispered strength. She caught Daniel's stare, only briefly before focusing on Sophie, whose wide eyes examined her with open curiosity. Sophie broke the silence with a bright giggle. "Mr. Rabbit is hungry too," she announced, holding up her stuffed toy. Lila knelt beside her without hesitation, lowering herself until she was eye to eye with the little girl. "Well then, we'll have to ask the waiter if they serve carrot cake for distinguished rabbits," she said with playful seriousness. Sophie's laughter spilled across the table, innocent and unrestrained, shattering the tension Daniel had been carrying since leaving the penthouse. He felt his defenses wobble, unexpected warmth edging into the guarded space he had built around his heart. Daniel cleared his throat, trying to anchor himself. "You two seem to get along quickly," he said. Lila brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her lips tugging into a shy smile. "Children don't judge the way adults do, they know when someone's safe." Her words lingered longer than they should have. Daniel glanced at Sophie, who was busy feeding imaginary carrots to her toy, then back at Lila, unsure how to respond. For years he had relied on walls, strategies and distance to protect himself. Yet within minutes, this woman had crossed through without asking permission. Menus arrived. Sophie leaned into Lila, whispering about her favorite desserts, and Daniel noticed how naturally she listened, nodding as though each childish comment mattered deeply. Few adults offered Sophie that kind of attention. Daniel realized he was watching a bond form before his eyes, a connection he had not invited but could not stop. He ordered his usual steak, almost by reflex, while Sophie requested pasta with a sauce she might only eat half. Lila chose a salad, though her eyes flicked toward the dessert section before she shut the menu quickly. Dinner unfolded gently, the rhythm led by Sophie's unstoppable curiosity. She asked Lila about colors, animals, and stories, and every answer came with a touch of imagination that made Daniel lean in despite himself. Lila described pandas painting the sky with bamboo brushes, dolphins hiding treasure chests under the waves, and foxes wearing scarves during winter strolls. Sophie squealed with delight, banging her fork like a drumstick. Daniel couldn't help but smile. He noticed the way Lila's hands moved as she spoke, not with rehearsed gestures, but with the honesty of someone who wanted to bring joy. He sipped water, listening more than speaking, and found himself studying. Unlike the women he usually met in his corporate world, Lila's presence carried no agenda. There was no calculation in her tone, no subtle performance to impress. She was simply there, grounded, authentic, and Sophie adored her. Daniel's chest tightened with conflict. He knew bonds could break easily, and his daughter had already lost too much. Still, the sight of Sophie's joy was undeniable. For the first time in years, Dinner felt less like an obligation and more like a gift. The waiter brought bread, and Sophie immediately offered a piece to Lila, who accepted graciously. "Thank you, Miss Sophie," she said, exaggerating her manners. Sophie giggled again, and Daniel caught himself wishing moments like this could last long. Lila met his gaze briefly, something unspoken passing between them, an acknowledgement of the child's power to disarm every defense. The conversation shifted toward safer ground. Daniel asked about her work, though cautious. Lila explained she spent her days surrounded by children at Bright Beginnings, a daycare she had joined 2 years ago. Daniel's brows lifted. "You work there? That's Sophie's daycare." Sophie clapped her hands in delight, confirming it with excitement. "Miss Lila tells panda story," she shouted across the restaurant. Several diners turned and smiled. Daniel froze. He hadn't realized the connection was deeper than coincidence. Lila's cheeks flushed, but she didn't deny it. Instead she leaned closer to Sophie and whispered, "You weren't supposed to give away my secret." Daniel's hardened exterior cracked another inch. He had imagined a stranger tonight, someone faceless and easy to forget, not the person who had already touched his daughter's imagination. Plates arrived, steaming and fragrant. Sophie dug in enthusiastically while Lila helped twirl pasta around her fork. Daniel watched, unsure whether he was more surprised by Sophie's willingness to accept help, or by his own comfort in letting someone else step into the space he had fiercely guarded. His appetite faded beneath the growing realization that this evening was not just an obligation anymore. It was becoming something he hadn't allowed himself to imagine, the start of possibility. He shifted uneasily, cutting his steak without tasting it. His focus locked on the easy rapport between child and woman. As the meal continued, Lila shared small fragments of herself, not oversharing yet not hiding. She spoke of baking on weekends, of long walks when the city was quiet, of her younger brother who had grown into his own life. Nothing extravagant, just slices of reality, but each piece drew Daniel in. He found himself leaning forward, wanting to know more, even as he reminded himself not to want at all. Sophie filled gaps with stories about her rabbit's adventures, and each time Lila responded as if it were the most important tale she had ever heard. The restaurant's music softened, blending with Sophie's occasional laughter. Daniel realized he hadn't checked his phone in nearly an hour. For a man who lived by constant updates, that silence was startling. He didn't miss it. He only noticed the warmth at the table, fragile but undeniable. Lila reached for her water, brushing Sophie's hand by accident, and apologized softly. Sophie giggled again, unbothered. Daniel felt the tension in his shoulders ease, replaced by something unfamiliar. Hope. He told himself not to name it. Not yet, but the sensation remained. The waiter cleared plates, leaving behind the scent of herbs and roasted garlic. Dessert menus appeared, but Sophie was already yawning between giggles. Daniel prepared to signal for the check, but Lila leaned forward, whispering something that made Sophie laugh so hard she nearly toppled from her chair. Daniel caught her just in time, steadying her in his arms. The laughter lingered, filling a space he hadn't realized was empty. He glanced at Lila, who smiled softly, not for effect, but simply because she enjoyed the child's joy. It was real, unpolished, and unperformed. Outside the glass, the city continued to buzz, yet for Daniel, the world had narrowed to this table. As they prepared to leave, Sophie rested her head on his shoulder, half asleep yet still clutching the rabbit. Lila stood, smoothing her dress, her pride intact but her expression gentler than before. They walked toward the door together, a trio formed by chance yet connected by something large. Outside, the night air carried the chill of the city, neon lights painting the pavement. Daniel knew he should guard his heart, keep his distance, and remember promises to himself. But the echo of Sophie's giggles, paired with Lila's warmth, unsettled every rule he had lived. When did a child's smile remind you of what's real? The restaurant's noise faded into a gentle hum, as the set plates were clear, leaving behind only the soft clink of glasses and the low melody of jazz. Sophie leaned comfortably against Daniel's side, her rabbit propped on the table like a silent participant. Daniel glanced at Lila, curious yet cautious, waiting for the inevitable awkward pause. Instead, she surprised him by speaking with quiet certainty, her voice carrying a note of honesty that cut through the polished atmosphere. "I suppose you already know I work at Bright Beginnings," she said softly. "That's where I met Sophie." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity with which she revealed herself. He nodded, trying to mask his surprise. "She mentioned your stories," he said carefully. Lila smiled faintly. "Yes, the pandas. They're silly, but they help calm children before naps." Her smile faltered, replaced by a shadow of memory. "I started at the daycare after everything changed. My parents died in a car accident when I was my brother Aaron was 15. Suddenly I was mother, father, sister, everything at once." Daniel studied her. Most people in his world introduced themselves with resumes, achievements and carefully rehearsed stories meant to impress. Lila's words came without performance, each detail delivered plainly, as though she had no reason to polish her truth. He leaned forward unconsciously, caught by the sincerity in her tone. "Your brother?" he asked carefully. She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. He was 15 when it happened. I was just 20. We didn't have anyone else. I finished college classes at night, worked days and made sure he got through high school. When he left for his own future, I needed steady work and bright beginnings offered me that." Sophie lifted her head at the mention of cupcakes, eyes widening. "Cupcakes?" she asked sleepily. Lila chuckled, brushing crumbs from the table that weren't even there. "Yes, little one. Chocolate, vanilla, sometimes lemon. They keep the lights on." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You bake to pay rent?" She met his gaze directly, unashamed. "Cupcakes don't seem like much, but they cover gaps when the paycheck falls short. People like sweet things, even when the world feels bitter." Her words lingered, a quiet resilience woven through each syllable. Daniel tried to imagine her evenings after long days at the daycare. He pictured her standing in a small kitchen, mixing batter while bills piled on the counter. He saw her boxing frosted cakes for delivery, exhaustion heavy yet determination stronger. He felt something shift inside him, respect, admiration, a recognition of effort that rarely crossed his path in corporate circles. Sophie clapped her small hands. "Miss Lila tells panda stories at daycare," she declared proudly, breaking the solemnity. Daniel's head turned, shock flooding him. "You never told me that," he said to Sophie. She shrugged with sleepy innocence. "It's our secret." Daniel blinked, realizing this woman had already been part of Sophie's world before tonight. Not a stranger, but someone who had shaped his daughter's days without him even knowing. The revelation unsettled him, yet in an oddly comforting way. Lila leaned back, eyes dropping for a moment before rising again. "Children need wonder," she said quietly. "After my parents' accident, Aaron couldn't sleep. I started telling him stories about animals doing impossible things. It gave him something to hold on to. I guess I never stopped creating. Bright beginnings gave me a room full of listeners, and sometimes it feels like those stories are the only inheritance I can offer." Her words hung in the air, heavy yet beautiful. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her truth settle inside him. He had spent years constructing fortresses out of wealth and responsibility, yet this woman built hope out of flour, sugar, and imagination. Daniel considered how easily she had laid out her life, not as an appeal for pity, but as a testament to survival. She wasn't selling herself or asking for anything. She was simply telling the truth. He felt his usual cynicism falter. In boardrooms, stories were weapons or shields, calculated for impact. Here, across flickering candlelight, a story became something else, raw, unguarded humanity. Sophie leaned across the table, reaching for Lila's hand. "Tell Daddy the story about the panda who built a castle," she urged. Lila laughed again, though her voice trembled slightly. "That one is Sophie's favorite. The panda gathers shiny stones, one at a time, even when the other animals laugh at him. He keeps building until the castle is tall enough to touch the stars. It's about patience, about believing something small can still reach high places." Danielle absorbed the metaphor, recognizing in her words a reflection of her own life. Small acts, steady persistence, building something greater than circumstance allowed. He found himself admiring her more with every sentence. He caught himself staring and shifted his gaze, unsure of what unsettled him more, the way her story mirrored her resilience, or the way Sophie adored her with such ease. He cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. "Most people wouldn't handle that kind of responsibility at your age." Lila tilted her head, neither defensive nor self-congratulatory. "Most people don't get a choice. You do what you must, and eventually it becomes who you are." Daniel sat back, her words echoing louder than the jazz. He realized she wasn't asking for sympathy. She was simply stating a truth that had carved her character. For a moment he thought about his own life, the empire he had built, the skyscrapers with his name etched in glass, the endless meetings that filled his day. All of it seemed immovable, yet here was a woman who had crafted survival out of flour, sugar, and stories. She had faced tragedy and carved something lasting without resources or power. The contrast left him quiet. Sophie yawned, curling into his arm, but her small voice added one last spark. "She makes everything better, Daddy." Daniel felt something deep within shift again. The waiter returned briefly to clear the table, breaking the spell, yet Daniel couldn't shake the shift within himself. He watched Lila thank the man politely, her dignity intact, her presence steady. Nothing about her demanded recognition, yet everything about her commanded it. He realized he was respecting her, not out of obligation but instinct. He had never expected to feel that tonight. He glanced down at Sophie, who was drifting towards sleep with her rabbit tucked close, safe in a world Lila had helped create. The restaurant's lights glowed softer as the night deepened. Daniel found himself reluctant to leave, not because of the date Nathan had set up, but because he had glimpsed something real, something his wealth could never manufacture. Lila adjusted her coat slowly, as though preparing herself to step back into cold air. yet Daniel wished he could pause the moment. The city outside still roared impatient and glittering, but inside, a fragile stillness wrapped around the three of them. He let silence stretch, savoring the fragile calm. What small act of courage inspires you? The evening stretched longer than Daniel had intended, each moment reshaping his expectations. He had walked into Lucien's, believing it would be an inconvenience, a favor or donation. Nothing more. Yet now, as the waiter placed the final dessert plate between them and dimmed candles flickered across polished glass, Daniel found himself resisting the end. Sophie, perched in her chair, with a rabbit at her side, scribbled loops and shapes on the back of a napkin with a pen the staff had brought to keep her entertained. Lila's laughter drifted softly as Sophie explained her drawing. Daniel sat back, his mind weighing thoughts he could not ignore. When the check arrived discreetly on a silver tray, Daniel glanced at it, then deliberately set his wallet aside. A flicker of hesitation passed across his chest, guilt mixing with curiosity. He wanted to. Too many encounters in his life had been transactional, people drawn to his name and what it carried rather than who he was. Tonight had felt different. Startlingly so, but he needed proof. Could she face the moment without performance, without expectation? He leaned back casually, running a hand along his cuff to mask the decision. Lila noticed almost immediately. The envelope rested unopened, but Daniel made no move toward it. Her brows rose slightly, though she said nothing at first. Sophie hummed softly, lost in her drawing. Lila finally reached for her purse, her fingers brushing over the worn fabric of her wallet. "Don't tell me Mr. Harper forgot something," she teased lightly, her tone lifting the weight of the silence. Daniel tilted his head, feigning embarrassment. "It seems I left my wallet at home." The lie tasted strange on his tongue, yet he forced it, watching her reaction. Instead of hesitation, Lila pulled out a weathered card without flinching. "Good thing I didn't order the lobster," she said with a small laugh. "My salad and that chocolate cake will be the most extravagant splurge I've made this month." She slid the card across the table, unbothered, her humor genuine. Daniel felt his chest tighten unexpectedly. He had expected awkwardness, a flicker of discomfort, maybe even irritation. What he found instead was composure, self-possession, and the willingness to carry what wasn't hers. The waiter accepted the card, and disappeared, leaving Daniel with the echo of her words. He studied her across the table, every detail sharpened by candlelight. She was not trying to she was not leaning into drama. She simply accepted the moment and acted. Sophie broke the quiet with another giggle, holding up her napkin proudly. "It's a rabbit house," she announced. Lila leaned over, admiring the crooked square. "That's the finest house I've ever seen," she said warmly, encouraging the child as though her drawing was a masterpiece. Daniel swallowed hard, conflicted. He had created the test expecting to protect himself, yet instead, he felt something uncoil inside him. This woman, who baked cupcakes to pay rent and told panda stories to children, had just disarmed him again, not with grand gestures, but with a quiet decision to cover what wasn't hers. He thought of all the evenings he had spent with people whose kindness had been currency, whose smiles were math. Lila's humor, her steady hand, her refusal to make the moment heavy, those things cut through his doubt in ways he had not prepared for. The waiter returned with the receipt, offering it discreetly to Lila. She signed quickly, sliding the slip back without ceremony. Daniel reached forward impulsively, covering her hand with his briefly. "You didn't have to," he said, his voice lower than intended. She withdrew gently, shaking her head. "It's fine. Everyone forgets sometimes. Besides, Sophie made the evening worth every penny." Sophie giggled again, drawing another crooked rabbit, oblivious to the tension flowing between the adults. Daniel leaned back, unsettled. For a man used to measuring risk, used to calculating every move, he realized he had underestimated her entirely. She wasn't swayed by wealth or reputation. Her gesture wasn't a sacrifice for the sake of appearance, but a simple, instinctive act. That truth rattled him more than any hostile takeover ever had. Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, she paid for us," she whispered in surprise, as if it were the most extraordinary thing. Lila laughed again, smoothing Sophie's hair. "That means next time you owe me a cupcake," she teased, her humor softening what might have been uncomfortable. Daniel exhaled slowly, shaken by how easily she had refrained the scene. Next time, the phrase lingered in his mind, dangerous yet enticing. They gathered their things as the night deepened outside. Neon spilled across the boulevard, reflections bending in rain-slick streets. Daniel guided Sophie toward the door, still mulling over the shift within him. As they stepped toward the exit, Daniel felt an unexpected weight pressing on him. He had staged the moment to confirm suspicion, but instead it had undone his certainty. He had wanted proof of pretense and found proof of sincerity. The dissonance unsettled him. His life was built on anticipating motives, investors seeking leverage, employees seeking promotion, acquaintances seeking access. Yet here sat a woman who neither flinched nor fawned. She simply acted. The honesty of that response haunted him. As they neared the lobby, they lingered near the entrance while the driver pulled the car around. Sophie clung to her rabbit, bouncing with the excitement of staying awake past her bedtime. Lila crouched again, speaking softly to the girl. "Make sure he doesn't eat too much candy before bed," she whispered. Sophie giggled conspiratorially. Daniel watched the interaction with an ache he hadn't expected, a reminder of how easily Lila slipped into their small world without force. He should have been relieved when she didn't seize the moment to leverage his name or wealth, but instead he felt something deeper: admiration. As the driver opened the door, Daniel hesitated. He turned back to Lila. "Thank you," he said again. More earnest this, she smiled, not politely but warmly, as though the evening had mattered to her in ways beyond obligation. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Sophie." Sophie waved sleepily, her rabbit's ear flopping in the air. The car pulled away, yet Daniel found himself watching her silhouette shrink in the reflection of glass and neon, until she disappeared entirely. Inside the car, silence settled for a few moments. He glanced down at Sophie, who was fighting sleep. "Daddy," she murmured. "I like her." Her words were simple, but they carried an unshakable weight. Daniel brushed her hair gently, staring out at the rushing city lights. He had spent years avoiding connection, protecting both himself and his daughter from disappointment. Yet tonight a woman had stepped past those walls, not by force but by quiet kindness. The test he had staged as a shield had transformed into proof of something rare. The thought stayed with him long after the city faded into the night. The following morning, as sunlight spilled across the skyline, Daniel found himself still replaying the night. He remembered the way she had joked about the dessert, the ease with which she signed the bill, the absence of calculation in her eye. He compared it to countless dinners past, evenings drowned in forced laughter and hidden expectations. None of them lingered the way this one did. Sophie chattered about her rabbit's new house drawn on the napkin, insisting they keep it as a treasure. Daniel tucked it into his briefcase without comment, though the gesture stirred something profound in him. He realized with growing clarity that what unsettled him wasn't the money or the test itself. It was the discovery that genuine kindness still existed in places he had stopped looking, and that, more than anything, was what broke through his cynicism. For once he didn't know how to strategize, how to spin the moment into something manageable. It simply was. The thought scared him, but somewhere beneath the fear, it also gave him hope. Ever been stunned by someone's quiet kindness? The night pressed cool and sharp against the city as they stepped from the restaurant. Daniel adjusted Sophie's coat, while Lila slipped her arms through her own, ready to part ways. The driver stood by the car, waiting. Daniel gestured toward the door, offering, "We can take you home." Lila shook her head gently, pride steady in her stance. "Thank you, but I'd rather walk. It's not far." She smiled faintly, though her eyes revealed extortion. Before he could argue, she turned down the block, her steps purposeful. Daniel hesitated, then signaled the driver. "Follow her," he instructed quietly. The car moved slowly, headlights dimmed, keeping distance as Lila's figure wove through the scattered crowd. Neon lights bled into puddles, horns echoed down side streets, and the rhythm of the city pulsed. Sophie pressed her face to the window, watching curiously. "Why aren't we giving her a ride?" she asked, her voice soft with sleep. Daniel hesitated, searching for words. "Sometimes people want to walk on their own," he said finally. Sophie accepted the answer, curling deeper into her seat. The car turned into narrower streets, where glamour faded to grit. Brick buildings leaned tiredly against one another, their paint peeling, fire escapes rusting in the glow of flickering lamps. Lila's steps never faltered. She crossed an intersection, clutching her coat tighter against the wind, then disappeared into the doorway of a walk-up with a cracked awning. Daniel leaned forward, tension prickling across his shoulders. "Stop here," he told the driver. They waited as Lila climbed the steps, visible through dusty glass panels, until she vanished into the stairwell. From the car, Daniel could see her silhouette framed briefly by a window on the fourth floor. She moved with unhurried familiarity, slipping off her coat, draping it neatly, then setting down her bag. Light from a single lamp cast her movements in warm tones against worn curtains. Sophie yawned, sliding into his lap, her rabbit dangling from her hand. "She's safe now," Daniel whispered, though the reassurance was for himself as much as for his daughter. Yet he couldn't look away. The curtain shifted, revealing more of her space. Lila sat at a small table by the window, papers spread before her. She lifted a pen, marking bright stickers on children's drawings, her expression softening, as though each effort mattered. Daniel watched, struck by the contrast, his world measured in contracts and numbers, hers in colored stars and story. She paused briefly, picking up a sock with a hole at the heel, threading a needle with practiced care. Danielle's throat tightened. There was no glamour, no performance, only the quiet dignity of someone who refused to give up. He realized he admired her in a way that unsettled, not admiration born of beauty, though she had that, nor fascination born of novelty, though she carried that too. It was respect for resilience, for the ability to create life out of fragments, to build something steady out of scarcity. He had measured worth in boardrooms and balance sheets, yet here he saw worth defined by kindness, persistence and humility. Sophie stirred against him, murmuring in her half-dream, "She's nice." Daniel brushed his daughter's hair, his eyes never leaving the wind. He thought of the test he had set earlier, the false claim of forgetting his wallet. The ease with which she had paid without resentment echoed louder now. She had walked away without seeking recognition, choosing instead to carry her evening home to this small apartment, where patched socks and panda stickers mattered. Daniel felt the weight of his own life differently. The penthouse, the cars, the constant noise of ambition. Suddenly they seemed hollow compared to the simplicity he watched through that window. The driver cleared his throat quietly, unsure whether to wait longer. Daniel raised a hand, silencing him. He didn't want to leave yet. Watching her move around that modest space stirred something he couldn't name. It was not pity, it was not guilt. It was admiration tinged with longing, a reminder of how far he had drifted from the rawness of life. Lila stretched, rubbing her neck, then leaned over the papers again, humming faintly to herself. Daniel imagined the sound, though he couldn't hear it through the glass. He leaned closer to the window, studying the building where Lila lived. The entrance light flickered, sometimes glowing, sometimes fading, as though undecided whether to stay alive. A man passed by carrying groceries in a paper bag, nodding absently before continuing up the street. Life here felt raw, unvarnished, filled with effort invisible to the wider city. Daniel realized Lila carried this world with pride, never once asking to be rescued. The thought unsettled him in ways that meetings with investors never had. Minutes stretched, as he continued watching her through the worn curtain. She rose from the table to fill a small kettle, the steam fogging the glass slightly before fading. She poured herself a mug of tea, sat again, and continued her work. Every movement was ordinary, yet to Daniel it became extraordinary. It was a window into someone who lived without luxury but with depth. She wasn't trying to be noticed, yet he couldn't look away. Sophie's rabbit slipped from her grip, falling to the car seat. Daniel picked it up gently, tucking it against her chest, then turned back to the window. He thought of the nights he had spent alone after Sophie's bedtime, staring at city lights from glass walls, feeling the emptiness echo around him. Lila's small apartment seemed richer than his vast penthouse in ways he hadn't considered. She had no skyscraper view, no expensive art, yet she possessed something he had been missing. Connection, purpose born not from ambition, but from care. He remembered the panda story Sophie had mentioned earlier, about building a castle one stone at a time. The metaphor felt clearer. She was building her own castle, not of marble or glass, but of patience, persistence, and courage. The driver shifted uneasily again, glancing in the mirror, perhaps wondering why his passenger lingered in silence outside a stranger's home. Daniel ignored the question and spoke. His world demanded explanations, but tonight he wanted none. He simply wanted to hold the image of her sitting at that table, sewing quietly, giving herself fully to a life that offered so little and yet became so much through her effort. At last, when the kettle had cooled, and the lamp dimmed slightly, Daniel gave the order to move. As they pulled away, he felt the tug in his chest deepen. He imagined her finishing her tasks, tucking the graded drawings into folders, folding the mended sock into a drawer. He imagined her sigh of relief before slipping into bed, exhausted but proud of a day survived. That picture stayed with him longer than the city lights racing past. He realized he admired her not just for what she endured, but for how she endured it, with dignity, humor, and a kind of strength that required no witnesses. That night, as Sophie slept soundly against him, Daniel understood that pursuit didn't always mean chasing something you want. Sometimes it meant recognizing what you needed before it slipped away. Ever wonder how quiet moments reveal truths louder than words? The days that followed seemed to soften Daniel's guarded life in ways he hadn't anticipated. What began as a chance encounter at a restaurant quietly unfolded into small moments that threaded themselves into his daily rhythm. Coffee meetups before work, short exchanges of text that carried warmth, and afternoons where Sophie would run into Lila's arms at daycare as if they had always belonged there. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself looking forward to something beyond the next meeting or the next deal. He let himself believe cautiously that perhaps life was offering him a second chance. But then, without warning, the rhythm broke. Messages that once lit up his phone with gentle humor and small stories grew scarce, then stopped. Coffee invitations went unanswered. Even Sophie noticed. "Why didn't Miss Lila say goodbye today?" she asked one evening, clutching her rabbit with confusion. Daniel offered no answer, unable to mask the unease building inside him. Each silence stretched longer, heavy with questions he could not voice. Days turned into a week, and still there was nothing. Then, one evening, a letter arrived. It was tucked neatly in an envelope, addressed in handwriting that was firm yet unpretentious. Daniel held it for long minutes before opening it, sensing the weight of finality inside. He unfolded the page, his chest tightening as he began to read. Lila's words were simple, but every sentence carved itself into him. She wrote of gratitude for his kindness, of joy in the time spent with Sophie, but beneath each line lay a quiet farewell. She confessed she could not belong in his world. She described patched clothes and nights spent budgeting dollars against overdue bills. She admitted her dreams were small, shaped by necessity rather than choice, while his life stretched skyward in glass towers and endless resources. I don't want Sophie to think I'm permanent when I'm not, the letter read. She's brave, brighter than the stars I tell her about, but she deserves someone who belongs in your world. I'm only a visitor. Temporary. Daniel's hands shook as he gripped the page tight. The words blurred as if the ink itself carried sorrow. He thought of the nights he had watched her window glow, of the patience in her voice as she told Sophie stories, of the quiet dignity with which she carried her life. None of it fit the picture she painted of herself in the letter. To him she was already part of Sophie's world, already part of his, yet the words pressed down like a verdict he hadn't expected. He sat in the silence of his penthouse, Sophie asleep in her room, the city stretching endlessly outside. For years he had feared loss, had built walls to prevent it, had promised himself never to feel that hollow ache again, but the letter forced him to confront that same fear again. The ache of it felt sharp, familiar, unwelcome. He wanted to fight, to demand she see herself the way he saw her. Yet the letter left no opening for argument. It was not written with hesitation but with certainty, as if she had rehearsed each line until it became fact. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping the paper until the edges crumbled. For a man who thrived on control, the helplessness was unbearable. He could not negotiate love. He could not outmaneuver absence. Sophie asked again the next morning why Lila hadn't come to daycare. Drop off. Daniel forced a smile, telling her Miss Lila was busy, but the lie felt bitter. Watching his daughter's disappointment cut deeper than the letter itself. Sophie had lost enough already. He wondered if he had been reckless in letting someone so quickly into their fragile circle. Maybe Lila had been right. Maybe this was always tempered. He moved through the day like a shadow, his meetings blurred, his words mechanical. Every moment reminded him of the absence, of the silence left behind. At night, when the apartment fell quiet, Daniel reread the letter until the ink seemed to blur. He tried to imagine her writing it, alone at her small table, pen moving steadily across the page. He pictured the hesitation she must have felt, the courage it took to walk away from something she admitted mattered. He realized the act itself was love in a way, protective, self-denying, and painful. Yet that truth offered no comfort. The absence remained. He longed to reach for his phone, to drive back to those narrow streets, to knock on her door until she answered. But pride and fear kept him still. Fear that she would not answer. Fear that she had already moved on. Fear that opening the wound further would leave him with nothing but Sophie's confusion and his own regret. Nights stretched, marked only by the sound of Sophie's soft breathing and the echo of the letter's words in his mind. He began to question himself, to wonder whether he had only imagined the connection, whether the warmth he felt had been one-sided. The doubt cut deeper than anger ever could. For a man who measured everything in certainties, the uncertainty unraveled him. He remembered Sophie's words in the car, "She's nice, I like her." The innocence of that truth haunted him. Children did not overcomplicate, they saw kindness for what it was. Yet adults found ways to ruin it with fear, pride and self-doubt. Daniel hated himself for letting it slip away so easily. He stared at the letter one final time before folding it carefully, placing it inside a drawer instead of tearing it apart. Some part of him hoped it would not be the last page between them, yet another part feared it was. Daniel found himself replaying every detail of their last conversations, searching for hints he had missed. A pause in her smile, a hesitation in her voice, the way she folded her coat tighter when they parted. Perhaps the signs had always been there, subtle warnings he chose not to see. He thought of how easily Sophie had reached for her hand, how quickly she had become part of their evenings. How could someone vanish from that space and believe it was for the best? The question gnawed at him. He walked the halls of his penthouse at night, restless, haunted by echoes of her laugh. One afternoon, Daniel stopped outside Bright Beginnings without going in. From the car, he watched children run in the yard, their laughter spilling into the street, but Lila was not among them. Another teacher guided Sophie inside, and the absence struck harder than he had prepared for. He told himself it was for the best, yet every instinct screamed otherwise. The empire he had built offered no answer to the emptiness left by one woman's retreat. He had faced losses in business, but this felt sharper, cutting through layers he had thought impenetrable. At night, Daniel dreamed of letters unwritten, words he wanted to send but never did. He drafted messages in his head, then erased them before they formed. He feared breaking the fragile boundary she had set. He feared pushing her further away. So he stayed silent, caught in a limbo between longing and respect. His heart waged war against his reason, and every morning the battle began again. Sophie carried her rabbit around the apartment, asking when Miss Lila would come for another story. Daniel kissed her hair, unable to answer. Each moment of distance taught him something about himself. He realized he had hidden behind skyscrapers and suits, behind control and certainty. Lila had stripped those shields away without asking, and in her absence, he felt raw, vulnerable in a way he had never allowed. Yet vulnerability carried truth. The letter, painful as it was, revealed how much she mattered. He could no longer pretend otherwise. That knowledge settled deep, reshaping him slowly, forcing him to confront feelings he had long denied. What do you do when the very thing you long for convinces itself it cannot stay? Morning light settled over Chicago in a pale hush, the streets damp from an overnight drizzle that left the air smelling clean. Daniel parked across from bright beginnings, and sat still, listening to the faint chorus of children inside, a rhythm of laughter and tiny shoes against tile. In his hand, he held Sophie's drawing, edges softened by small fingers. Crayon figures stood together beneath a bright sun. A tall man, a little girl with rabbit ears on her headband, and a woman in a simple dress. Above them, Sophie had printed block letters with careful pride, family. He traced the waxy lines once, gathered himself and crossed the street. Inside, the reception smelled of tempera paint and lemon cleaner. Paper cutouts of stars lined the corkboard, each tagged with a child's name. Daniel spoke to the receptionist, voice steady but low, and asked whether Lila was free for a moment. The woman gave him a kind look and said she would check. He waited by a shelf of picture books, listening to a class singing the alphabet with offbeat confidence. When Lila stepped into the foyer, she paused, caught between surprise and caution. She wore a soft cardigan over a navy dress, hair pulled back, eyes guarded. Daniel lifted the drawing, not as evidence, not as pressure, but as truth. Sophie made this, he said. She carries it to breakfast, to bath time, to bed. I thought you should see what she sees. Lila's gaze fell to the page. Her mouth trembled, and she steeled it with effort. She's a dreamer, she whispered, though the tremor in her voice sounded like hope fighting with fear. She's also honest, Daniel replied. She draws what matters. He hesitated, then added, you matter. Lila folded her arms as if warmth might protect her from what came next. Daniel, she began, gentler than he expected, I never wanted to hurt her. Or, I wrote that letter because I do not fit your world. I live in a walk-up with a flickering hallway light. I mend socks and count coins. I buy flour when rent is paid and skip dessert when it isn't. Your life reaches the sky, mine reaches to the next month. She lifted her eyes. I am tempered. He stepped closer, keeping his voice soft, so the music of the classroom wouldn't break. After the accident, I learned to manage grief by building walls around every soft thing. I told myself control would keep Sophie safe and keep me from shattering. But control turned into distance. I could feel our home grow quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. Then you sat with her, and talked about painting at night. You paid a check you didn't owe without turning the moment into theater. You walked home instead of asking for favors. I mistook your courage for a risk I could avoid. The truth is, I have been avoiding life. His throat tightened, but he held her gaze. My wife died the winter Sophie turned 2, he said, words careful, reverent. Hospitals, monitors, polite voices, saying the kindest, hardest thing. After that, I swore I would never ask the world for tenderness again, because losing it felt like being dropped from a great height. So I hid inside work and schedules and shiny rooms that echoed. Then you appeared in a worn coat and refused to be safe. You made everything feel alive again without trying. Lila blinked fast, fighting tears. I wanted to be brave, so I left before we all fell, she said. I thought stepping away would spare you. It hurt less to call myself temporary than to be told I was. Daniel shook his head and held up the drawing again. She named us, he said. I'm not asking for a promise that erases rent or history. I'm asking for presence, for coffee after pickup, for pasta nights where we burn the garlic and laugh anyway, for slow, ordinary days that add. Footsteps pattered from the hall. Sophie rounded the corner with her teacher, spotted them and broke into a run. She barreled into Lila's legs and wrapped her arms around the cardigan, face bright with certainty. Miss Lila, Daddy brought the picture, the child announced, reaching for the page with triumph. Lila crouched, smoothing Sophie's hair. It's beautiful, she managed, voice threaded with relief. Sophie turned the paper around and tapped each figure. That's Daddy, that's me, that's you, she said, then looked up. So, we're holding hands. Daniel felt something open in his chest, a quiet releasing of breath he hadn't known he held. He looked at Lila without hiding. I can't promise I'll never be afraid, he said, but I can promise to tell the truth when I am. and I can promise to listen when you are. Lila reached for the drawing again, fingertips hovering above the waxy lines as if they might burn. I am tired of being useful only when I am invisible, she admitted. I want to be seen and still welcome, even if I show up with patched sleeves and small plants. Stay, Daniel said, not as a command but as an invitation. Stay for pickup today, walk with us to the park, help me hold the world steady for her, and I will hold it steady for you when your courage shakes. Lila laughed once, a sound that cracked and mended in the same breath. I don't own shoes that fit your restaurants, she said, a final defense that wasn't really a defense. Good, he answered. I am learning I prefer places where the floor squeaks and the tea comes in chip mugs. Sophie tugged Lila's hand toward the hallway. Come see the stars we made, she urged. Lila stood, looked at Daniel one more time, and let the child lead. In the classroom, paper constellations drifted from the ceiling, each star tagged with a wish. Daniel hovered by the door while Lila read them aloud with Sophie. Some wished for puppies, some for snow, one for a new baby brother, and one for a mother to come home soon. Lila's eyes lingered on that last wish, then moved back to the drawing in her hand. She slipped it into a folder as if storing something fragile. When class settled, the teacher smiled and sent Sophie with Daniel for an early lunch. Lila lingered in the doorway, uncertain. Daniel lifted the drawing between them one last time. She made this because you gave her back wonder. I'm asking you to share that with us. Not as charity, not as a duty, but as life. Lila's shoulders lowered, tension releasing like air from a balloon. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead briefly to his shoulder, a quiet embrace that felt like a vow to try rather than an oath to never waver. I want to be seen, she whispered, the words landing like a key turning. Then be, he answered. Sophie wedged herself between them with a grin so wide it outshone the fluorescent lights. She lifted the drawing like a banner, declared that today required cupcakes, and asked whether pandas preferred chocolate or lemon. Lila laughed through tears and chose lemon. Daniel promised both. They stood there a moment longer, three people inside a hallway smelling of crayons and soap, the kind of place where beginnings prefer to occur. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, the sky brightened, revealing a blue that felt like permission. They walked out together. Daniel carried the drawing. Sophie skipped ahead. Lila matched his pace, still cautious but present. At the curb, he opened the car door, then hesitated. No rush, he said. The park is closed. Lila nodded. They crossed at the light, passing a vendor cart that smelled like cinnamon. Daniel bought a paper bag and handed it to Sophie, who announced they were perfect fuel for adventure. On a bench near the playground, Lila sat with the child while Daniel stood a step away, grateful for the sight before him and the silence that did not feel empty. He took that extra step and sat beside them. We can go slow, he said quietly. Slow is exactly right, she answered. Sophie leaned back against both of them, the sun warming her hair. Lila rested her palm over the drawing folded in her lap and breathed as if her knot had loosened. Daniel felt the same shift inside him, a recalibration of how a day could feel. No speeches, no grand designs, only presence holding the edges together. He looked at Lila and let gratitude settle into words. Thank you for walking back, he said. She nodded. Thank you for coming to find me. They rose when the wind sharpened. Sophie insisted on carrying the drawing herself, marching forward like a herald. Lila slipped her hand into Daniel's, tentative at first, then steady. The gesture was small and enormous at once. He squeezed gently, a promise of patience. In the car, Sophie buckled in and announced she had decided pandas preferred lemon. Lila laughed again, softer now, no edge of apology running beneath it. Daniel started the engine and watched the mirrors fill with sky. The city moved around them, busy as ever, yet inside the car, everything felt newly quiet, a fragile bond drawing breath and learning how to live. The library smelled of paper and polish, a quiet sanctuary from the restless city outside. Rows of books towered like sentinels, their spines catching soft light that filtered through wide-arched windows. Children gathered on a circular roof patterned with bright stars, their voices buzzing with anticipation. In the center sat Lila, her simple dress brushed smooth. Sophie balanced on her lap with a rabbit tucked close. She held open a picture book painted with pandas marching through constellations. Her voice rose and fell with rhythm, playful in one moment, soothing in the next, weaving the children into her tale. Sophie listened as if the world began and ended in that circle, her smile wide as Lila pointed to the sky of painted stars. Daniel leaned against the column at the edge of the room, letting the moment unfold. He had sat through countless speeches, conferences and negotiations, but nothing held him like this. Lila's words wove images that danced in children's eyes, each giggle a spark lighting the air. Sophie looked up at her with adoration, as if the entire world fit within the curve of her lap. Daniel's chest tightened, not with fear this time but with recognition. Love wasn't grand gestures. It wasn't skyscrapers or headlines. It was presence, laughter, shared wonder. The story ended with pandas returning home beneath a sky glowing pink with dawn. Lila closed the book, her voice soft, lingering in the hush that followed. The children clapped, then drifted away to find their parents or wandered toward the shelves. Sophie clung to her, unwilling to move. Daniel approached, footsteps careful against the polished floor. Lila glanced up, eyes catching his, carrying warmth threaded with a question. He offered his hand, and she took it slowly, standing with Sophie still nestled between them. They walked through the library's corridors, Sophie skipping ahead to point out paintings of city landmarks in watercolor. Daniel and Lila moved at an unhurried pace, their silence comfortable. "You have a gift," he said at last. Lila shook her head gently. "Stories are small things. They don't change bills or rent." He stopped, making her face him. "You're wrong. They change hearts. I know because mine changed." She blinked, taken off guard. Sophie returned, waving her rabbit like a banner. "Family," she said proudly, reminding them both that the child had already defined what mattered. Outside, the evening sky glowed pink and gold, clouds brushed with fire as the sun dipped behind the skyline. They walked together down the steps, the city alive with weekend bus. Vendors called out, buses hissed at curbs, and a violinist played near the fountain. Yet inside their small circle, quiet ruled. Sophie tugged Lila's hand, declaring with childlike certainty, "We're family now." The words dropped into the air with weight far beyond her year. Lila's eyes glistened, her lips parting as if to argue, then closing as though she finally believed. They crossed to the park nearby, where grass gleamed damp and benches faced the fountain. Daniel sat, Sophie climbing onto the bench beside him, while Lila settled at the other side. The child tugged them both closer until their hands touched. Daniel turned, watching how the glow of sunset softened Lila's profile. "Love is choosing to stay," he murmured. She met his eyes, the statement resting between them, unshaken. Sophie squeezed both their hands and hummed, satisfied. Lila exhaled, whispering, "I want to." Days later, in the modest kitchen of her walk-up, Lila found an envelope slipped beneath her door. Inside was an order form, neat and professional, requesting 200 cupcakes for a corporate event. At the bottom was a signature she recognized, Harper & Co. No note, no flourish, only the order. She pressed the paper to her chest, torn between laughter and tears. For years she had balanced survival on flour and sugar. Now someone had given her, not charity but a chance. She whispered a thank you into the quiet room, knowing who had made it possible. The cupcake order changed more than her kitchen. It gave her confidence, showed her that what she made with her hands had. She baked through the night, Sophie perched on a stool dusted with flour, Daniel carrying boxes when dawn came. They laughed at the mess, at the frosting streak on his tie, at the powdered sugar that clung to Sophie's hair. It wasn't polished, but it was real, and real was all they needed. The delivery went smoothly, and when she counted the payment later, she pressed her hand to the paper as if it were proof that dreams could grow roots. That evening, they returned to the library for another read. This time, Daniel sat with Sophie at a low table, while Lila arranged frosting on trays for the children. Sophie darted between them, carrying napkins, announcing flavors, her laughter filling corners of the room. Daniel marveled at how ordinary it felt, how extraordinary ordinary could. No skyscraper boardroom had given him this. No deal had felt as binding. Only presence, only choosing, only staying. He glanced at Lila, who caught his eye and smiled, flour dusting her sleeve. Later when the night fell and the event ended, they walked outside together. The city lights shimmered against the river, casting ripples like broken stars. Sophie fell asleep on Daniel's shoulder, rabbit dangling from her loose grip. Lila walked beside them, close enough that their arms brushed. "I'm still learning how to believe this," she said. "So am I," he admitted. "But every day, I want to keep choosing it." She nodded, her hand brushing his as if testing whether she belonged. He didn't pull away. He thought back to the first night he saw her, coat frayed, voice defiant with a taxi driver. He remembered Sophie's laughter at the restaurant, the wallet test, the fourth-floor window glowing with her quiet life. Every memory stacked itself into the present moment, like stones forming a bridge. He realized how far they had traveled together without meaning. Lila had not stormed into his world, she had simply stayed true to hers, until he found himself drawn to it. That authenticity disarmed him more than any deal ever had. He watched children scatter through the library stacks, their voices echoing like bird song. A boy carried a pile of dinosaur books, a girl trailed ribbons from her braids, and a teenager whispered homework questions to a volunteer. Lila stood at the center of it all, steady as if she had always belonged here. He felt pride, a word he had reserved for quarterly reports and skyscraper deals, now redirected toward the woman who had redefined value for him. When she closed her eyes for a brief breath, he thought she finally allowed herself to feel the belonging she had denied. Sophie returned with a book clutched backward, insisting it was about pandas, though the cover showed foxes. Lila laughed, adjusted the book, and promised to make up a panda version later. Daniel laughed too, not at the mistake but at the harmony of it. He realized how natural it felt, how rare ease could be. His life had been built on proving worth, yet here worth was proven in a child's smile. In a story told without embellishment, in a hand held beneath a fading sky. He knew now that was what he wanted to spend the rest of his days protecting. At the park, Sophie made them sit side by side while she ran circles with her rabbit. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching her spin. Lila folded her arms, then let them fall, shoulders finally dropping in relief. "You scare me," she admitted quietly. Daniel turned. "Why?" She bit her lip, then said, "Because I've never had something that felt like it might last. Because staying has always meant waiting for it to break." He considered his answer carefully, then spoke with steady conviction. "Then let's build something that doesn't need to be perfect to last. Let's make it strong by being honest, not flawless." Lila lowered her head, tears trembling at the edge of her lashes. Sophie ran back and jumped into her lap, shouting that rabbits loved chocolate cupcake. Lila laughed, tears spilling anyway, and hugged the girl close. Daniel leaned back watching, feeling the knot in his chest finally begin to loosen. That night he carried Sophie upstairs while Lila followed, careful not to wake. In the doorway, he turned, holding the sleeping child, and asked softly, "Will you come back tomorrow?" Lila met his eyes and nodded. The answer was quiet but certain. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe to Heartfelt Tales for more stories that spark hope and love.